Thank you everybody for coming. We're gonna start our event now. So if you'd like to take a seat, absolutely. If you want to mill about, that's absolutely fine. So thank you for joining us for this event on policing emergencies. We have two exceptionally wonderful writers here, and they're gonna talk to us about the last 3 years of, somewhat hellish time that we've all been through and why it was particularly hellish. For one reason or another, obviously not all of the reasons. So I'm joined by Lambros Fatsis, a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Brighton, and Milena Lam, a lecturer at the University of Law in London. They've written a book called Policing the Pandemic, How Public Health Becomes Public Order. And it goes through the ways in which the public response or the governmental response to the pandemic exposed a lot of the state violence that happens against minority communities in the UK and abroad quite consistently, but then reached a lot more of us than it usually does. And it also kind of looks at why this is obviously an issue and what we could be looking for instead from our state or from our communities. So feel free to add to that, change that, however you would like. But I will begin with our first question, which is, what were the key moments in the pandemic that alerted you to the idea that this was being responded to as a public order issue rather than a public health issue?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because there was kind of a paradoxical relationship between the fact that seemingly the government didn't want to lock down initially, right? So there was this kind of insistence on keeping everything open and kind of going about daily life, and actually the government were very late to take action. So there was that kind of thing going on, as well as when they did take action, it suddenly became very, very punitive, right? The approach began to be very centered on kind of criminalizing certain behavior, being out and about in groups, and I can't remember all the different COVID laws that came into being now, but Lambros probably remembers better than me. But there was a real shift in the way that it was being spoken about, and this move from something that seemed very kind of light touch, we have to keep things open for the economy to keep moving, to suddenly, no, we're locking down, and actually the things that we're saying are actually going to come into force as law, and that you can be punished by the criminal justice system for not following them. So for me, that was, when we started writing the book, that was at the forefront of my mind, was this kind of relationship between this light touch economy first versus really heavy punitiveness. And especially when it came to, the kind of eat out to help out scheme, right? It was this real kind of strange, paradoxical kind of information that was being given to us, where it was like, okay, so we could go to prison for certain things, but then you're going to incentivize us to go and eat out at restaurants. It was, it seemed quite bizarre, but actually when you look at something like the history of neoliberal political thought and doctrine, this is precisely the kind of thing that it advocates, which is to say very strong state in terms of policing, in terms of law and order, but everything to do with the economy was supposed to kind of like not intervene. I mean, of course, they do intervene, but there's this idea that, yeah, it's a free market with a strong state, and a strong state means, yeah, lots of police, lots of prisons, lots of criminalization.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for everyone for, being here. I mean, I guess the key moment was actually at the very beginning, I think, in the sense that, and the situation is actually a little different in Scotland, so I'm also aware of that. So I guess a lot of our critique is probably, focused mostly on, England and Wales, both in terms of the policing context as well as the legislation that was made. So, for example, in in England, at the outset, this was treated as something that was a public order issue. So the very first thing that the government did was to actually create legislation to criminalize what people could do and don't, right? So the very first step was not to take any action that would resemble, any public health initiative or response. It was at the beginning, let's pass laws to make sure that people get, penalties for doing something that they're not supposed to do. So something that we describe in the book as the public being policed as the virus rather than being protected from the virus, okay? Or another way to put it would be to think about how such legislation made it a crime to spread the virus rather than focusing on how to eliminate the virus, which is pretty much, saying the same thing in two different ways, which I often do, so I apologize for that. But I think what's interesting about that, and that's the reason why we wrote the book, I guess, was to use COVID as a case study to show that this is really what states do. Okay, so looking at how states respond to something like a public health emergency or crisis, or whatever crisis for that matter, reminds us what the state is, what it does, who does it do it to, and who does it do it for. So what does it mean, for example, for the state to immediately go into policing overdrive over everything else, right? That tells us something about how the state thinks and what it does, and what it wants to do, and who matters, and who doesn't matter. So I think that's a very, very kind of important consideration here. Another one, which is kind of more legalistic maybe, but actually I think has broader social and political implications, is that we need to remind ourselves that a lot of that legislation in England and Wales actually was imposed by decree. Okay, so there was zero parliamentary scrutiny over such legislation. It was not something that was discussed in Parliament, right? It was something that was imposed, at the stroke of a ministerial pen, and what a health minister that was, right? So I think that's really important. And what's also important, I think, to note is just how much of that emergency, since that was kind of the operative word that you used, and I guess the key word for that panel, how much of emergency laws and emergency policing then became normalized. So I think it's very important for us to remember that much of what seemed draconian at the outset then took different forms and different forms of legislation as time went by. For example, the initial regulations that were supposed to simply target us as virus spreaders then became reintroduced in successive bits of legislation, like the Policing Courts and Sentencing Bill, which then became an act. And then a lot of the things that could not make it into what became an act, that is to say, a bill that became law, which was left out and now is getting reintroduced as a public order bill. And all of this thinking behind, what people can do and what they can't do, and protesting is a big no-no in this. So we could think of all this as, pieces of anti-protest legislation became normalized in the long run, which was the fear at the outset, right? So essentially what I'm trying to say is that the exception and the emergency became normalized as time went by because that legislation created the opportunity for that to happen. And I think that's important for us to also remember, so that we don't just think, oh, these laws were just passed now. Well, there's a more intricate relationship between how the thinking for such legislation started in the context of COVID, that we now find ourselves in a moment where a lot of the anti-protest legislation bears the hallmarks of those initial bits of legislation. Sorry, I give a very long and long-winded answer, but...
I think it was good. You're all good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think it's kind of building on that point, but it's you've been talking about emergency, the word emergency, and in the book, you give discussion to, or you discuss how language, the way that things were talked about, played a part in how the pandemic was perceived, how it was often talked about as a battle. Like how did this come about, and like what were the effects of it? And I guess like you talked a little bit about how that now kind of has an effect, but what were the effects of it then? Do we still see the effects of that now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this was something that I became really interested in, this idea that, you know, you can wage a war on a virus. And this was what was touted by politicians in the media as well, the idea that, yeah, this is a kind of military strategy, right? Which kind of ties in with what Lambros was just saying about this kind of emergency, right? We're in a state of emergency, we have to wage this war, and that means that we can, you know, pass legislation and govern by decree, essentially. That all has a very long history. So that was not inaugurated by COVID. It has a very, very long history. And something, you know, we could think about its kind of antecedents in 9/11, for example. So after 9/11, the way that the state of, you know, a state of exception, a state of emergency was called, and then in its wake comes all this anti-terror legislation, which is then used against protesters, right? So you can see the kind of same logics being applied. But certainly the language of war, the language of battle, I think is so interesting in this case because it's also the language that's used when we talk about individual immunity, right? And this is something that I became really fascinated by, was the history of this concept of immunity, which was originally a legal political concept that then gets taken up in medicine and becomes a medical concept taken from this kind of legal language, which I think, firstly, that's quite interesting, that it gets transposed from legalistic language into medicinal language about the body. But that also, that the way we talk about immunity and fighting disease and ourselves fighting disease, all of that is a construction, right? There's nothing natural about that language. All of it is politically and socially constructed, and I thought that it was interesting the way, that we talk about that on an individual level, that we individually fight a disease and wage a war on it, you know, inside our bodies, but also that, the body politic, the state, then uses the same kind of language of war, of battle against the virus to kind of, I suppose, to sort of justify or legitimate certain behaviors which are indeed very violent, very militaristic, very punitive, you know, inside the state and at its borders and abroad as well. So I think the effect of that language is big. And I also think that, we need to think about it critically also in order to denaturalize it. There's nothing natural about talking about viruses in this way. And remembering that it has a political history, I think can help us to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, obviously. I guess another way of approaching this is to think, you know, what would happen if a different type of language was adopted? So, for example, you know, following from what Milena said, there's nothing stopping us from using different words and different thinking when there's something like a threat or an emergency or a crisis looming, right? So instead of a militaristic approach to it, one could, let's say, adopt a more, you know, another one that would be more focused on care and welfare. So instead of waging a war on virus and instead of, you know, passing laws that criminalize what people can and can't do, one could think about, okay, so what could the state do to enable people to build, you know, ethical and safe community? So again, instead of the language being about, you know, war and policing and clamping down and penalties, you know, it could shift to something that would be, you know, investment in public and other infrastructure, better ventilation, less crowding, different work arrangements, more purification and ventilation of rooms, different sick leave provision, more exposure to green spaces, you know, all positive things. So it's interesting how all of these measures, which most public health experts would say this is exactly what you need when something bad happens, and even when something bad doesn't happen, that were not really addressed at all as adequate responses to something. And what that then reminds us, to just bring it back to the state, is that the state is responsible for not providing all of those things, which means that that's how people are made vulnerable to diseases and illnesses and so on. It's precisely because we do not have all of those things as infrastructure and essentially a life that is primarily taking place in a context of welfare and care, that we have, you know, the emergencies, and that we have, you know, the threats that we are faced with. And I guess a useful insight into that, although it's a very overused and not always brilliant essay by Charles Tilly, who likens the state to essentially a criminal organization by saying that essentially the role of the state is that of a protection racket, where a threat is created and then the state charges for its reduction. So much of what I'm talking about is precisely that, you know, something, even if it's an infectious disease like, say, COVID-19, doesn't happen in a vacuum. And if all of those things were in place, we wouldn't need punitive measures to respond to them. All we would need to do is rely on infrastructure and you know, communities, ethical communities of care and welfare that could respond to this. But in the absence of this, what we get is policing, because we don't have anything else.
So I think both of you touched on this idea that there is history. We might have, many of us might have been shocked by the way that the pandemic was dealt with, by the way that it happened. However, it was not a shock to many, and that's something that you raise in the book quite a lot, is this, we should not refer to this as unprecedented. It's not the event, it's not new. And I think the way that you discuss it, the whole book is very, you take a lot from Black feminist thought, you take a lot from abolitionist thinking, and kind of weave that into an understanding of what is the history of this? Let's not cut it off. So could I get you to kind of discuss that a little bit, like why it's not unprecedented to see this kind of action, this kind of public order, and why maybe it surprised some of us for reasons of just the way that society is?
Yeah, I think I was kind of touching on it with what I said before, but certainly I think there's a tendency when, you know, these big things happen and we see a very extreme response. Yeah, there's a tendency to refer to it in terms of its exceptionality, in terms of, as you say, as being unprecedented. And I think I want to resist that temptation to position it like that, because it is to gloss over, you know, how violent the state has been consistently towards racialized minorities, but in particular Black people in the UK and the US, for example, and also immigrants and at the borders and the violence of borders as well. And I think that when we talk about, the violence of public order and the excessive criminalization and these kinds of things, these things didn't happen out of nowhere, and they didn't come into being because of COVID, right? These are structuring governmental logics that then get exacerbated by something like COVID. And I think we could, again, going back to something like 9/11, we could say a similar thing. You know, the Islamophobia and extremely violent border practices were not, they did not come into being because of the event of 9/11, right? This is something that was already being done to some extent, but this event kind of exacerbates it and makes those logics much more visible, perhaps, and much more visible to people who maybe normally wouldn't be exposed to them, right? And I think this is something that we really saw in 2020 when, after George Floyd was killed, and in the middle of a pandemic that was disproportionately killing Black people, there was a kind of sense in which people sort of saw what had been very, perhaps, for many people under the radar, right? Not for the people affected by it, but for populations that are not heavily policed, for people that don't come into contact with state violence on a day-to-day basis. There was something quite revealing about what happened in 2020, I think. But we have to remind ourselves that this was not a new thing, and this was an exacerbation of logics that were already in place, I think.
Yeah, and I guess in addition to that, I think it's also important for us to bear in mind that even something that looks like a medical crisis or a natural crisis is more often than not actually a human catastrophe, in the sense that the example I'm thinking of in particular is Hurricane Katrina, for example, where we could think, well, a storm is coming, and therefore that's going to mean that people are going to suffer precisely because an unprecedented amount of water is going through a city which is going to flood. But the only reason why New Orleans flooded in 2005 was because of neglected infrastructure in the levees around the Mississippi River and so on. So actually, what that tells us is that if that infrastructure was there, that natural catastrophe wouldn't have devastated those who are already vulnerable in an environment where they were exposed to essentially, harm. And I think that's very important for us to remember. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore has this really brilliant definition of racism that I think teaches us a lot about the kinds of themes that we're talking about. I'm going to remix it a little bit because there's just a few things I don't like about it, so I'm just going to omit those words, but I'm still, accrediting, obviously, Wilson Gilmore with that. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm gonna, give you my version of it, which is so her definition of racism in her book Golden Gulag runs as follows, and she describes it as state-sanctioned, and I'll give you her definition first, and then I'm going to change a few words. I think that's fair. So her definition is state-sanctioned or extra-legal, group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death, right? The words I would change a little bit would be the extra-legal bit, and I would say state-sanctioned, legalized vulnerability and exposure that is group differentiated to premature death. Now, the reason why I'm offering you that definition is, again, to remind us that not everybody is affected by such catastrophes, which are posed as natural and universal and medical, which means that it affects everyone. The very word pandemic, that's what it pretends to do, right? Pan means everyone, demic means public, so all of us, right? The whole of us who comprise the public are affected by it. Not true, right? Not everybody gets affected in the same way by, natural universal catastrophes. Such disasters and such crises actually, select those who are affected by it from specific social groups that are already marginalized. That is to say, already exposed to what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls, premature death and vulnerability to premature death. So I think we should always bear that in mind, I guess, as a response to that, and how this is not unprecedented precisely because we keep on seeing it in a context where there's, disinvestment and organized abandonment and economic as well as cultural and social and political dispossession.
And I suppose, bringing in the example of Hurricane Katrina and discussing, the fact that there is a long history of it not being unprecedented, it kind of behooves us to remember that we are in a state of climate crisis, right? This is this is unfortunately probably not the last of the emergencies that we will see within our lifetimes quite soon. And there are many communities around the world that consistently experience crisis and emergency because of things that are perceived as, many of them will be completely outside of the bounds of things that can be dealt with, but these things will get worse. And we currently have shown that we don't really have an infrastructure that can deal with much of it. And so we need to build that. And it kind of reminds me of something that you wrote, which is the unequal distribution of death is preserved and naturalized by states whose only response is heavier and heavier policing of borders and of people. We can discuss that slightly. I'm conscious of a little bit of time, and this is my warning to our audience to rack your brains for questions, because I will call upon you, so I expect to see hands, my friends. And this is a reminder to people who are watching on the internet as well. And then my little warning to you both. After this question, I ask for radical reimagining. So two things at once, I think. So let's start with this one. How did we see the state response globally? So you mentioned things like unequal distribution of vaccines and things like that, and heavier policing. So just before we move on to hopefully a more radical moment of imagining, is there anything we'd like to discuss on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the quote that you're referring to, I think it comes just before or just after a discussion of vaccines, and the fact that the global distribution of vaccines in itself was so unequal, and the fact that the global north not only got the vaccines first, but actually started hoarding the vaccines. So Canada, in particular, I think, had 5 times the amount that it needed to vaccinate its entire population when the vaccine was first available. So, and then, there were whole continents, right? Africa being an example where there was, barely none. And not even, care workers and medical workers were in receipt of vaccines at that time when Canada were hoarding. So this became a really visible, I think, representation of these logics that we're discussing, which is precisely what Lambros was just mentioning with regards to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism. This does not just happen within states, but obviously happens on a global level between the global north and the global south as well. And we have to ask, how did we get to a situation where a vaccine was available, but then some countries were able to just hoard it, and other countries were prevented from getting any altogether. And I think these are really important questions about, we could talk about the history of colonialism, we could talk about the history of, the global history of racism, and how this comes into play in terms of responses to medical emergencies, and in response to, who gets any kind of protection from these kinds of viruses, right? So we see not only disproportionate numbers of Black and brown people in the UK dying from COVID, but then globally there's disproportionate numbers again of people in the global south who are vulnerable to it and more vulnerable to death. So there's a kind of 2 different levels that's operating on. And then in the global north, the response seems to be not only are we going to kind of more heavily police people within our borders, but at the border as well. We're going to shut borders down, and we're going to make the bordering regime even more violent than it already is, in the name of, national security or whatever. So really, really horrifying response.
Yeah, I guess what I find, really useful and challenging in your question, because it's a difficult one. perhaps can be answered if we think a little bit about, bordering as a form of order itself. So if we think about bordering as a hierarchical ranking of, I guess, human value and human worth. And maybe even think, okay, what does a border actually, what do borders do? And essentially what they do is that they protect, the sovereignty of the nation state as a political mechanism. So, for example, in order for us to have, nation states need borders. And in order to have borders, you need to have immigration laws. And in order to have immigration laws, you need to have a concept of what immigration is. And in order to have a concept of what immigration is, you need to have a figure of who the migrant or the immigrant is. And in order to do that, you're drawing on racial logics in order to construct belonging. So I guess just breaking it down in that way reminds us of why we have precisely the kinds of relationships and inequality that Milena described. And I think it's important for us to be thinking about often, the very words that are being used when which kind of returns us, I guess, to some of the initial questions, the way we deal with language as a resource for thinking about stuff, and really pausing for a moment and think, whoa, it's interesting that we use that word. And Nadine El-Anani is somebody who does really brilliant work and plays very, very beautifully and playfully with the word bordering by placing the B in brackets to precisely relate to that relationship of ordering and bordering. And I think that's a very useful intellectual kind of device or instrument that sharpens our thinking about belonging, socially, culturally, politically, and what does it mean to not belong, and what dangers and threats one is exposed to if they are deemed as unbelonging, right, to the nation state or to the sort of, I guess, legitimate political community, right, that counts as valid and is normally associated with notions like citizenship and so on. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you both. And now for my favorite question, which might be difficult, but I wanted to ask something that I feel like I've learned over the last couple of years with the books that I've been reading, with the activists I've been speaking to who are incredible humans, is that we can't create a new world without first imagining it. And so I ask at this moment for a radical reimagining or a radical imagining of the future. What might a response to a crisis, a health crisis, look like if it was genuinely about public health and public care rather than public order?
I think it's a really good question. I don't know if I have a very good answer for you. I struggle with it because I think there's a tendency, let me put it this way. Mariam Kaba, who's an abolitionist, organizer and writer in the US, and if you haven't read her work, I would really, really, really recommend it because she's brilliant, and she writes a lot about police abolition, but she writes it in such a way that it's just very, very succinct and clear and concise and excellent. So would really recommend. But she says this thing, it's not just that we can't imagine a world without police, it's that we're disciplined into not having that imagination. And I think the same can be said of the state. I think it's not just that we can't imagine a world without the state, it's that we're disciplined into not having that imagination. And so I think a common response to that question would probably be a social democratic one, and to say we need, better funding of the NHS, for example, and we need better distribution of resources, essentially, and that the state can perform, its protective role over its citizens by doing this. And I think my response to that is that dream of that benevolent social democratic state, I think, has died. I don't think it ever really existed. I think it's a kind of romanticization of a certain post-war welfare state that we saw in Britain after World War II. But I don't think that the state can act as a protective shield. I think its very reason for being, the logics that it operates on are and will always be violent. And I think that, we see this with what Lambros was just discussing in terms of, a state necessarily needs a border, which necessarily is policed, which necessarily excludes. So there will always be people that are excluded from the care, in scare quotes, that the state can offer. It will never be universal, unquestioned care. And I think that's what we need, right? We need some kind of universal, unquestioned care where it's not about what passport you hold, it's not about your race, it's not about where you come from, but it's about what do you need. And that is not something that I think we can get through the state, social democratic or otherwise.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm going to try and pretend that I do not share Milena's view on I guess, the state and what you can do within it. So for a moment, I'm going to pretend that that I'm thinking like a politician or like a policy person. And I could say, okay, well, here's things the states could do with their resources to respond to this at the outset, without policing being the kind of knee-jerk response. More testing and tracing, more financial support, more funding to the NHS, more funding for welfare and healthcare, and all of this practiced in I guess, non-coercive ways, through investment, through welfare provision, through care, and all of this upheld, in a cultural context of solidarity and mutual aid, that again is not tainted by suspicion and so on and so forth, right? But that would be my kind of, politician's take. I guess the more, the more honest take, and the only reason why I did that was to show you that there's a great deal that the state can do, in a different direction that it steadfastly refuses to do. Okay. I guess how to reimagine a different response? Well, it would have to be one that would need to be non-hierarchical, that would need to be non-violent, that would need to be non-extractive, that would need to be not oppressive, and that would need to be more convivial. And funnily enough, all of those, I guess, ideas come from, the rich reservoir of abolitionist thinking, as well as black feminism, which are two perspectives and two intellectual traditions, as well as political traditions, that would draw heavily on the book. And it is often even in the language that abolitionists use, and not just abolitionists who are kind of scholarly necessarily, if we define that term very, very narrowly, but also poets and artists who think very much like abolitionists, again, in the context of black radical thought and black feminist thought in particular. So I'm just always thinking of how Jane Cortez, for example, who's a poet, plays with the word elsewhere, and to create elsewheres as alternative, moments of imagining different places that we can get to. Or one of my favorite sort of, again, books and phrases of all time, which come from June Jordan's only novel, which is written entirely in Black English, which is called His Own Where, and whereas in WHERE. And it's an entire love story between two teenagers whose central message is exactly how is it that you can build elsewheres, right? Through a relationship that is based on love, that it's based on peace, that is based on all the kinds of values that are totally alien to the state. And I find that a really, really powerful, neat encapsulation of what abolitionist thinking or different forms of imagining the social world culturally, socially, and politically might look like. So I think that novel alone is a great way to start, and just by getting ourselves busy with thinking, how could things be differently? is a great place to start, right? And I know it sounds vague, and I know it doesn't sound particularly satisfactory to most people, because we have been brought up in a culture where we expect, 10-year plans or 5-point programs or, bullet points of solutions that we are just going to hand over to people and they just need to follow it. And I would actually, I think that's actually a betrayal of what, an active civic culture that is underpinned by, open, free association and assembly would look like, that we really need to think about what it is that we need and how we can get it. And abolitionist thinking does exactly that. It puts us on the spot to think, okay, we need to do that work. We need to think those thoughts. We need to come together and understand and come up with ideas of what community looks like, right? What safety looks like. What interdependence looks like, what political love looks like. And I think I'll leave it there.
Is it okay if I wait until questions? Yeah, thanks. I think something that also comes out from what both of you were saying was, and something that I just realized now, was that our response to the pandemic was to very much isolate yourself, to very much individualize yourself. And that was, medically necessary in a lot of ways, but a radical reimagining also allows for a sense of community, which I think did come through mutual aid or through, notes on doors, like in tenements saying, I can get your groceries for you. Or, hey, do you need, this person has been struggling, someone give them a phone call. And these are very small things. They don't restructure our state. But we did see a natural progression in some small ways to kind of try and be that support for one another in and amongst the ways that we could. Often, with a lack of understanding of what we were up against, because we are very much, everyone was trying to react at the time of more information coming and often it being contradictory or often it not being quite correct at the time and then responding again as more information came out. But I do think it kind of showed a natural inclination towards the compassion that we very desperately need maybe more of. And that natural compassion was not just for oneself of like, give yourself a break, it's terrifying, it's very traumatizing to be so isolated. We can all take more rest, or we can all try to, but also I'm gonna think about my neighbor. I'm gonna think about, my gran who I can't see in person, but I will call her. I will think about how lonely it is. I will walk someone's dog. These kinds of very small things. But kind of returning to kind of like maybe a more organized reaction, I wondered if you, and this may depress us slightly, or maybe it will be uplifting, but have you ever heard or seen an example of this kind of radical reimagination, or this kind of response of genuine public concern and response to a crisis? Heard or seen in the past, in history, just now, whenever?
Well, I think what you were just saying very beautifully about mutual aid at the beginning, is a really good example of this kind of care in action. And really, there was a real moment at the beginning of the pandemic when it really kind of seemed that anything was possible. And it very quickly kind of got shut down by the state, I think, and the violence of the state. But there was this sort of moment when, there were mutual aid groups, but also, in the US, there was a serious proposition that, the police could be defunded, right? And that suddenly a lot of things which had never, ever been on the table seemed that they were on the table. So that was a really exciting moment. And I think just kind of remembering those moments when, and also acknowledging that when we talk about abolition and when we talk about care, and we're not talking about this utopia that exists somewhere in the future, but we have to think about, okay, there are communities doing this right now, and actually the practices that we engage in, that various communities engage in right now, kind of give us a window into that future that isn't here, but nevertheless is being practiced by certain groups, often marginalized. So there's examples of mutual aid you were giving, but also something like the people that, you know, when an immigration raid happens, the people that gather around the immigration van and physically stop it, right? That's another example for me. I mean, what an incredible thing that was, and that we've seen more and more of recently. This kind of action, I think is that kind of care. It is that kind of response. And it's worth remembering that, yeah, we're not just talking about a far-flung utopia that we're naively considering, right? This is political action that's happening now.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think you answered your own question really beautifully.
Sorry.
No, that's great. It just feels, awkward to have to answer it, because you already did. But I guess the way I would approach it would be that, that possibility always really exists. And that's a real thing. But, because we do like real examples, one that I would use, which I think, I know that we discussed backstage, was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which in its 10-point program, its 10-point program included free breakfast for kids, as well as healthcare and vaccines and all of those things. And it is not accidental that, of course, a Black Power organization was so heavily policed by the FBI, and initiatives like COINTELPRO, which was gathering police intelligence to infiltrate as well as break what the Panthers were doing in the state. So that's a very, very concrete example of how you do this, and how you do this at a community level. But another thing that came to my mind, unsurprisingly, because I really am that keen to share, June Jordan's novel, His Own Words, is a phrase in that book where, and I quote, which is that love is all the land that we need. And the reason why I love that phrase is because it really kind of summarizes what we've been talking about how political love that is rooted in ethical sort of relationship of conviviality, it doesn't include bordering, doesn't include exclusion, it doesn't include property, it doesn't include possession, but it's a real sort of, political commitment and ethical commitment to others. And she does that in just one phrase, right? Love is all the land that we need. It really reverses just so much that we are, educated and socialized into. And I think, again, that's the beauty of, radical political imagination, and particularly the varieties of abolitionist thought that we are, I guess, inspired by in particular. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. All right, so we have Ailey with a microphone, and thank you so much for waiting. I think we will go for you first, and then everyone else, you're up.
Hi. Over the course of this discussion, there hasn't really been much touching on ableism or eugenics, or the ways that the state was able to affect the actions that people could take for the prevention of infection towards other people. So things like mask mandates, things like rollout of the vaccine and the speed with which it was done, and the prioritization given to certain groups. Things like when the guidance to stop wearing, that you had to wear masks in places like buses and grocery shops has been removed. The way that has effectively forced a lot of chronically ill and disabled people, including newly disabled folks from COVID, into shielding again, so that they can't be active members of society. And that definition of racism that you gave, where people would, a group that was more likely to have a premature death, definitely applies in the case of many disabled folks and socioeconomically marginalized folks of all various marginalizations on top of that as well. So can you talk to us a bit about crip theory, and how could the world work if, for example, there weren't state mask mandates? We've certainly seen that the world doesn't feature caring people who wear masks indoors if they're not legally made to. because they're more interested in their own personal freedoms than the collective health and well-being of the community. So what would you propose instead, or is there still a value for a state in that kind of context?
Thank you for raising that. Genuinely really appreciate that. And I pass over. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that really, really important question. And yeah, I think we should have raised this before. Certainly, I think that, yeah, I mean, a mask mandate is the bare minimum. And obviously, those have been lifted. And I really think, again, this speaks to what we were talking about, this logic of state, which is, it's so predicated on this idea of the individual, and it's so predicated on this idea of, essentially, you know, you have to look out for yourself and damn everyone else, right? And there's all this idea kind of being floated, you know, it's about personal risk. You do a personal risk assessment and you make your life decisions based on that personal risk assessment, which obviously in the context of something like an airborne virus is completely ridiculous, right? You can't make a personal risk assessment when there isn't a mask mandate and you don't know what the situation is going to be when you go out into a public space. And yeah, it's something that it has been horrifying the whole way through and continues to be horrifying is the complete and utter neglect of disabled and immunocompromised people, and the way that, yeah, the state seemingly was very willing to throw these people under the bus, but also has no issue or no qualms with lots more people being made disabled, right, by this virus, and something that we're continuing to see today. That doesn't seem to be a concern. The fact that a lot of people are being disabled by this virus, which for a state that seems so concerned about the economy, again, you know, it sort of almost seems contradictory. And then we have to think about, yeah, exactly what you're saying, these questions of eugenics, these questions of hierarchical organizing, but also something that I've been thinking about recently, a question that kind of keeps bouncing around in my head and I want to write something about, but you know, for centuries, the idea of a state was that it should protect its people, right, and the health of the people as well. And that in Roman law, you know, the idea of the state was that the health of the people is the supreme law. So this is like a centuries-old idea that seemingly has increasingly become undermined or overthrown, right? This idea that the state has some duty to protect the health of its citizens. Even this kind of minimal idea has seemingly gone out the window since COVID, right? It's not just that it doesn't want to protect its citizens, it's that it's actively imperiling the lives of its citizens, right? And so this has got me thinking, like, what is a government for? And what do we do now we're at this stage when seemingly the government is very, very happy for large numbers of the people in the state to die or be disabled by this virus? And that, again, you know, going back to that thing I said about the social democratic state, I don't think that that's why the social democratic state can't really be an answer as well. I don't think the state can be benevolent in that sense, but I do think, yes, there should be a place for mask mandates. The fact that they're not willing to even do that tells us, I think, everything we need to know about the state's priorities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a brilliant comment, and obviously, you know, we agree, and we're very sympathetic to. And I remember discussions that we had before writing the book. You know, about how we would address that, and I think, you know, we did discuss actually, you know, eugenics in that context. I guess what I would say in response is that, you know, anything which is obvious enough to say, but it's easy enough for us to forget, which is that anything that happens in an unequal context will have unequal outcomes, and this is you know, one example. But also I think you're very right to note that also at the outset, the language was deeply eugenicist, along the lines of, oh, we're sorry, there is this, really threatening, thing coming our way, and people will die, right? Of course, it's not going to be us, right? And it's not going to be people like us, but other people will die. And that's kind of okay, right? And that almost became policy to a certain degree. So, and even in later stages, actually, that then became, living with COVID, which is really a euphemism for dying from COVID but not caring about it, right? And that's a way of saying, well, it's okay, let's just learn to live with the disease, which is, let's try to find mechanisms for justifying that we have, as a matter of policy, chosen that people will die, okay? And that this is, by design. And I think that's also, crucial here, that even the things that we need to resort to behaviorally or otherwise is actually an indirect acknowledgement that we occupy unsafe spaces, right? Which again are not metaphysically imposed or preordained, right? They are designed. So we occupy spaces that are unsafe, that make us, again, vulnerable to illness and dangers and threats and so on. So I guess your comment, raised all of those really, really complex questions. So that's why I'm, I guess responding to them in such a scattered way. But that, that's what you made me think about, I guess, with your comment. And yeah, I 100% agree. I think, eugenics is the way that this was approached, at the outset. Again, as a political logic of, who matters and who doesn't and why.
This, just before the next question, so everyone rack your brains. This also reminded me of the way that we had a death count with very little acknowledgement of who died. So we would have, and eventually that count stopped. Like it stopped being announced, and it stopped being, people stopped even being counted in a broadcast sort of way. You have to look at the government website, or you have to go to people who are actively monitoring the situation, because it's still going on. That you can still find these figures, although I think that they're a little harder to get to. And quite apart from that, but I think that there was a really strange thing. I remember talking to some of our colleagues about it, was that it didn't allow for mourning. Like it didn't really allow for us to mourn people who we'd lost, because we weren't meant to remember that we'd lost them this way. Which I think also then fed into this idea of just carrying on, like it being status quo to lose people, and it being completely devoid of community and completely devoid of care. I don't quite know how to address that past that point. If anyone else has any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. I think we will have time for maybe one or two more questions. Let's make it one. I think we have one just over here, and then our writers will have some time to sign books and to have some discussion. Lambros needs to be off fairly soonish. However, yes, one more question, and then, yeah.
It's really high pressure having the last question. I liked what you said. You mentioned the climate crisis, and I was thinking in my head how it's probably going to be like not one big crisis that's going to hit us, but just escalating of these ones. And so from like an organizing perspective, I was wondering what kind of ideas you have of how we can not only be prepared for each crisis, but get ahead of it, because the state obviously will have plans for each crisis. They'll probably have an idea of what's going to be, how they're going to try kill off working class people next year, and how can we get ahead of that as organizers in a long-term way for like the decades to come as well. And like, for an example, how can we use the skills we had from the pandemic in the cost of living crisis? Because there will be, and there are a lot of similarities of things we can do.
Well, again, very good questions, I think. I don't know if I have a really good answer for you. I suppose for me, it's thinking about who are the most vulnerable among us right now, and how do we, as much as possible, rally around the most vulnerable to try and protect the most vulnerable from the ravages of climate change, state violence, policing, and that kind of thing. So I think those are the questions that are really at the forefront of my mind at the moment in terms of organizing, in terms of what do we do, in terms of kind of strategizing and going forward. It's hard to say, but I think community building, just trying to build senses of community where we are, trying to, somehow harness a little bit of that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, and to think about how can we harness some of that energy to build community, to build mutual aid groups, to, again, try and protect the most vulnerable among us, because, again, they're going to be, the most vulnerable are the people that are going to feel the brunt of this the most, right, in terms of climate change, in terms of the cost of living, in terms of state violence. So I guess those are the questions that I think about on a day-to-day.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something similar, but I guess the other thing that maybe is worth thinking about is that all the organizing and all the protests that happened primarily in the summer of 2020 were effective. Otherwise, we wouldn't have, anti-protest legislation that we have now. So clearly, a lot of that, protesting against police violence, against women, against, government inaction around climate change was so effective that the government is insistent on passing legislation to suppress such protests. So I guess it's a combination of both, of, keeping on organizing the way that was clearly so effective that it requires new legislation to criminalize protest, as well as building, community in precisely those kind of positive and constructive ways.
Yes. Yes. No? No. I'm really sorry, but come to the table and I would love to listen to you. So everybody, thank you so much for coming and joining us. There's so much more to say. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to talk to you. Please, thank you to my speakers. Thank you to you. Everyone, round of applause. We'll grab our masks and I'll see you over there, yeah? Thank you so much. How you feeling?